All right, so this week we're going to continue looking at artworks from the Renaissance era. Like I mentioned before, we're looking at works from the West, so we're talking about Italy up through the North, like modern day Germany and the Netherlands. We learned last week about the roots of the Western and Italian Renaissance, how things like the plague and beliefs like humanism, incredibly prominent and far-reaching power and influence of the Catholic Church, as well as wealthy patronage, and all had parts in shaping the ideals of truth and beauty of this time. And of course, the visual art, music, and theater, and basically everyone's lives until they died. This week, we'll turn our focus towards engaging in the visual art using more formal language, using formal analysis. So all specialties and focus areas have their own vocabulary, ways of discussing, approaching, and talking about their work. This can be super helpful because it gives us really precise ways to discuss something really specifically, and it links directly to whatever focus area it is. But it can also be tricky, and it can keep us from engaging in something that we don't have a lot of background knowledge about. So the hope this week is that we can kind of dig through some of those formal terms and all those extra little fancy-smancy art lingos so that we can actually get at the root of what's going on in this particular painting, how to ask questions, how to engage with like the actual content or the imagery or the approach the artist is taking, and how to use all those fancy smashy art words so that we can talk about art with each other and even with makers as well. So we're going to use one of my favorite paintings from the Renaissance era. It's called The Ambassadors by Holbein. It was painted in 1533 on wood using oil paints. Observe, analyze, interpret, and judge. These are the basic steps that form one way of formally analyzing a work of art. This provides you with a framework for stepping into the artwork one bit at a time. Working on being able to discuss an artwork is the first step, but analysis is about more than describing a piece. During analysis, the work is to move beyond initial perception of a work and use the analysis to evaluate and connect your ideas. For instance, to evaluate and connect the work with the context of the work, or specifically with the values of truth and beauty held by those involved in the commissioning, making, and observing of the work. So a little bit of background on the piece you're looking at. On the left, we have Jean de Danteville, who was a French ambassador living in England, who commissioned the painting and whose house the painting would be displayed in. On the left, we have George de Selle, who was a bishop and was Jean's friend. Holbein, the painter, was a Swiss painter who had moved from Basel, Switzerland to England, actually back and forth for the work available, partially because of effects on patronage from the Counter-Reformation, iconoclastic riots in Basel, among other things. Holbein will become the painter to the King of England, Henry VIII, who actually breaks away from the Pope, mostly because he had some trouble with wives. In all, he was married to 6 women. 1 died, 1 survived, 2 were divorced, and 2 were beheaded. The French ambassador was actually in England to keep his eye on the king during this time for France. So also remember that 1533 means that Martin Luther has published his theses, appeared before the Diet of Worms, and declared a heretic and excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Began work on a German translation of the Bible, and during this time, we also have Tyndale publishing an English translation of the New Testament in 1526. So that's just a little bit of background information. Let's actually start with observing the work. Observing this first step, when we were at the observation stage, we were thinking of the most basic information about a work, or basic observations. What colors are utilized in the work? Can you tell what medium it is? Is it a landscape or a portrait? Do you have any guesses about the artist or creator, or what time it was made? I like to add in a sneaky bit to observation, just to take it a bit further, and that's description. A basic overview of the work without any judgment or opinion or analysis or interpretation. Just a few sentences that answer the question, what do you see? Use specifics and correct terminology. Your description should give the reader a sense of what the work looks like. Imagine you're describing it to somebody who can't see. Are there elements of art, line, color, and shape that come into play alongside principles, value, balance, and contrast? Look for these in the work you see and see if you can find them. With Holbein's Ambassadors, what do you observe? Here are some questions to ask yourself. What is the subject matter? Is the work a realistic or abstracted rendition? What do you notice first when you look at the work? What kinds of colors do you see? How would you describe them? What sort of textures do you see? How would you describe those? What is the overall visual effect or mood of the work? So, what were some of the answers to the questions for you in regards to the work? I noticed that the work appears to be a portrait of 2 men, that the men appear to be important or powerful. I'll expand on that later, but for now I'm just stating observations. There are a variety of textures, fabrics, stone, wood, they are all very intricate and realistic. The overall mood of the work is somewhat serious or somber. I'll have to expand on that in my analysis as well. Right now, I'm just observing. There are many little tools and objects. Maybe in my analysis and interpretation, I will go into what I think they could mean based on my own experience, as well as what I know about the time or the history of the work itself. After observing, you can move on to analysis. Think expanding. Expand on your observations or on aspects mentioned above and look deeper to find connections in the work. Think about how those elements and principles work together with the content of the work. Here you discuss specifics. Separate the parts or the elements, thinking in terms of textures, shapes, forms, light or dark, bright or dull colors, types of lines, and qualities. Consider the most significant art principles that were used in the work and describe how the artist used them to organize the piece. You could ask questions like, how has the artist used colors in the work and what effect do the colors have on the artwork? How has the artist used shapes within the artwork? How have lines been used? What kinds of lines are used? What role does texture play in the work and how does it actually show up? Is it real or is it implied? How has the artist used light in the work? How has the overall visual effect or mood of the work been achieved by using the elements of art and principles of design? Does the artist try to create perspective? If so, how? How do parts of the composition relate to other parts of the composition? How does the composition work as a whole? Is the work balanced? Look back at what you've observed and described and expand on those thoughts. This is a good starting point. For example, the textures we talked about earlier in observation are especially realistically rendered. The artist had to utilize color and value to get the feel of the various textures to be just right. The work feels balanced overall. Even though there are a lot of pieces to the work and many details, the two large figures provide an equality in the weighting down each side of the work. Balance is also evident in the tools and items on the shelves. Once again, even though the objects vary in size and weight, that is the space they take up on the shelf, they provide equal feeling to the work. The work feels somber and serious. The colors are not muted, but they are not unnecessarily bright. The use of realistic and less vibrant colors lends itself both to a feeling of wealth and prestige as well as seriousness. Part of that somber feeling is also due to the rendition of the faces of the two men. They seem to be looking outward with no expression, and they appear to be contemplative. All right, now we get to interpreting. This is where you allow your observations, background, and general self into the picture. What does the work bring to mind for you? I always enjoy wondering why that might be the case for me. What do you suppose the work is trying to say? This is where you can let your opinion out a bit more, and just be sure to back up your opinion and thoughts with what you are seeing and or your possible reasons for your interpretation. Judging is the last step. This is where we think about if the work was successful, and this can mean a variety of different things, like does the work accomplish what the artist or patron set out for the work to accomplish, or is it formally successful? If this was an art critique, we'd wonder if you had, touched on all of the different aspects of the project. We're going to use this space, the judging space, in our course to consider looking at the work through the lens of the Renaissance era, or the era in which the work was created later on, and to make a judgment on how everything comes together to make sense of the ideals of the time. That is, what was valued as truth, what was considered beautiful. Go deeper with how the work interacts with the ideals of the time and how the work reflects the culture and history of the time to us today. This is a great time to go back into the aspects you noticed and analyze and make connections to the time. For us, that specifically means tying the work to the era through how we see the Renaissance values and truth and beauty showing up. So let's look back in. The figures are realistically rendered in a believable three-dimensional space. Remember that the invention of linear one-point perspective gave artists the tools to approach recreating realistic space rather than guessing at how to accurately represent both figures and space that were three-dimensional in look rather than simply flat. We know that accuracy, realism, and naturalism, that is, learning from observation of nature and working to replicate that accurately, was valued at the time and connected to the interests and values in the classical humanist movements. These sorts of components might touch on both beauty ideals as well as truth ideals, as the value of science and an increased reliance on observation and inductive reasoning falls within truths. However, these truth beliefs greatly influenced what was aesthetically appealing, like accuracy, balance, and naturalism. The tools of the world and the tools of the heavens on the shelves symbolize and hint to the church and to the discord within the church, and can be seen in things like the broken string on the lute. Look super closely. As well as with the Lutheran hymnal, which is open to a recognizable hymn to the Holy Spirit calling for unification in the church. We are reminded of the value of the truth of the biblical narrative and the power and influence of the church on the lives of those living during the Renaissance. Symbolism is being utilized not only in these aspects of the work to hint at the time and the discord in the church, but also in other aspects of the painting. We see the distorted skull, a memento mori or a reminder of death, common during the time, to remind us of where our ultimate destination is. There's also a crucifix in the corner, bringing us back to the reality of Christ's death and our own ultimate death. It feels as if each object is intentional and tells a part of the story, not just of the individuals in the portrait, but in the world they live in. The painting not only glorifies Jean de Dinteville and his successful life at 29 years of age, but also tells the story of the era, the values of those two individuals, and what they concern themselves with and are surrounded by. See what else you can deduce from Holbein's work, and later this week you will have a chance to choose a Renaissance work of your own to explore through formal analysis. We'll continue to utilize the same format for postmodern and contemporary works. Just substitute the context of the work as well as the ideals and values regarding truth and beauty for the time.